inspirerend jaar, denk ik, voor de mensen van Sovon, voor de tellers, voor de medewerkers, voor de bestuurders, voor de ledenraad. En ik denk dat we dat nu vandaag met elkaar heel goed kunnen afsluiten. Ik denk dat we vandaag een fantastisch programma hebben met mooie sprekers. En ik wens jullie allemaal heel veel plezier toe vandaag. Dankjewel.
Dankjewel. Goedemorgen allemaal. Nou, wordt aangeboden door deze sponsoren. En het is nog niet een goede presentatie, denk ik. Kan dat kloppen? Kijk, daar is die. Goedemorgen allemaal. Jullie zagen het allemaal staan, 50 jaar Sovon. Dat sluit mooi aan bij de soort waar ik het even met jullie over wil gaan hebben. Namelijk de Scholekster. Die kan bijna 50 jaar oud worden. De oudst bekende in Nederland was 46 jaar. Alleen gaat het niet zo goed met de Scholekster. En elk jaar in samenwerking met Vogelbescherming roept Sovon het jaar van uit. Dit jaar ook in samenwerking met Stichting Onderzoek Scholekster. En dit jaar was het, zoals jullie kunnen zien, het jaar van de Scholekster. En daar ga ik jullie even kort wat over vertellen. Het is voor het eerst in de geschiedenis dat een soort voor de tweede keer is benoemd binnen het jaar van. In 2008 was de soort ook al het jaar van. En nou ja, dit jaar dus wederom, maar nog steeds gaat het niet goed met de Scholekster. In ongeveer 10 minuten neem ik jullie mee in het jaar van de Scholekster 2023. Wie de podcast Vogelverhalen van Sovon luistert, die herkent de werkwijze. We beginnen even met het paspoort van de soort. Zoals jullie op het kaartje kunnen zien zitten de hoogste dichtheden broedvogels in het Waddengebied en het agrarisch gebied van Noord-Holland en Friesland. En ook in de Zeeuwse Delta. En vervolgens zien we ook in stedelijk gebied dat de Scholekster in aantallen toe lijkt te nemen. We hebben ongeveer 34.000 broedparen van de Scholekster en ongeveer 170.000 vogels die overwinteren. Kijken we dan naar rechts, naar de trendfiguren van de Scholekster, dan zien we een duidelijke afname in de afgelopen decennia, zowel voor de broedvogels als de waadvogels. En de groene pijl, dat geeft 2008 aan. En sindsdien hebben we het tij helaas nog niet kunnen keren. Nou ja, er speelt een hoop rondom die Scholekster. Het wordt ook wel af en toe de nationale pechvogel genoemd. In de broedgebieden heeft de soort te maken met toenemende risico's op overstroming, intensivering van de landbouw en ook een verhoogde predatiedruk, recreatie en dijkwerkzaamheden. En in de wintergebieden heeft de soort te maken met zeespiegelstijging, wisselend of afnemend voedselaanbod en ook verstoring. Nou, dat heeft samen toe geleid dat er te weinig jongen groot worden voor een stabiele populatie. En dat ook de soort in de winter het af en toe lastig heeft. Opnieuw dus het jaar van de Scholekster 2023. Hoe kunnen we nou data bundelen, kennis verzamelen om de soort nog beter te beschermen? Dit jaar was het speerpunt om onze inzichten te verbeteren, vooral op 3 punten. De stedelijke populatie, hoeveel Scholeksterbroeden bij ons in het stedelijk gebied. In 2008 was dit 4%. Hoe heeft zich dat ontwikkeld? Vervolgens kijken we naar de kuikenoverleving in het boerenland. En ook of broedplatforms een veilige nestlocatie kunnen bieden voor die Scholekster. En er is een hele hoop data verzameld dit jaar, ook mede dankzij jullie, vrijwilligers, tellers, enthousiastelingen. Dus dank daarvoor. Ik kom zo meteen terug op deze 3 onderwerpen. Eerst nog even een overzicht van andere activiteiten die hebben plaatsgevonden. Ik heb maar 10 minuten, dus niet alles kan ik helaas uitgebreid behandelen. Er zijn een hoop kleuringen afgelezen, er zijn slaapplaatsstellingen uitgevoerd en dat zie je ook rechtsboven. Een kaartje van waar de vogels voor verzamelen in het voorjaar. Op beleefdelente.nl van Vogelbescherming is een Scholekstergezin te volgen geweest op het dak. En aan het aantal unieke bezoekers, ongeveer 500.000. Nou, blijkt wel dat er een hoop betrokkenheid was bij de Scholekster dit jaar. Daarnaast ziet u ook op die foto een voorziening voor op het dak. Daar kunnen Scholeksters op broeden en de jongen eventueel onderschuilen. Die zijn ontwikkeld en her en der ook al geplaatst. En Vogelbescherming heeft met LPO, een beetje de Franse vogelbescherming, gepraat. Hoe kunnen we nou de steltlopers in Frankrijk beter beschermen? Want jaarlijks worden er nog steeds steltlopers en dus ook Scholeksters afgeschoten. En dat is wat de soort natuurlijk absoluut niet kan gebruiken. Dan dus de onderzoekjes die dit jaar hebben plaatsgevonden binnen het jaar van. Om te beginnen met de stadse Scholekster. Er zijn dit jaar 121 kilometer hokken geteld. Dat heeft een hoop gegevens opgeleverd en daar is dan een verspreidingskaart van de stadse Scholekster van gemaakt. Die is rechts in beeld te zien. Nou ja, dat geeft inderdaad gewoon goed weer dat die verspreid over heel Nederland in de steden zit. En ook uiteraard in stedelijk, vooral de Randstad natuurlijk, met veel stedelijk gebied. Zoomen we dan een beetje in op Amsterdam, dan zie je aan de randen van Amsterdam wat hogere dichtheden en die lijkt de stadskernen te mijden. Dus het is echt een soort die vooral in die stadsranden lijkt te zitten. Op basis van dit model lijken er ongeveer 6000 broedparen te zitten in stedelijk gebied. En dat komt dan ongeveer neer op 15% van de totale populatie. Dus dat lijkt ook sterk gestegen ten opzichte van 2008. Mensen konden ook zelf schoolexters volgen, die broeden op daken, via scholeksterophetdak.nl. Dit jaar zijn er maar liefst 1289 nesten ingevoerd. Dus dat zijn er een heleboel. Van die 1289 zijn er 680 met een vervolgwaarneming, waardoor die ook data daadwerkelijk gebruikt kan worden voor de berekening van de nestoverleving en het broedsucces. Sommigen hebben zelfs tot 23 vervolgwaarnemingen ingevoerd, dus dat is natuurlijk fantastisch. De analyse voor dit jaar moet nog uitgevoerd worden, dus die publicatie zal later volgen over dit onderwerp. Dan de kuikenoverleving op het boerenland. Dit jaar zijn er 365 nestkaarten ingevuld. Dus dat is een heel mooi aantal. Om de dataset nog wat meer te boosten, hebben we ook de data meegenomen vanaf 2019. Nou, kijken we dan naar het rechterplaatje rechtsboven van de dagelijkse kuikenoverleving per leeftijdscategorie. Dan zien we dat naarmate een kuiken ouder wordt, dat ook de overlevingskans, de dagelijkse overlevingskans toeneemt. Dus dat loopt op van 90% per dag naar 97, 98% naarmate een kuiken bijna vliegvlug is. Kijken we dan naar het onderste plaatje, de kuikenoverleving per jaar. Dus dat is de totale kuikenoverleving. Wat is de kans dat een kuiken daadwerkelijk groot wordt? Dan zien we een heel duidelijk verschil over de jaren. In 2021 was een heel goed jaar, 2019 een vrij slecht jaar. En 2023 was eigenlijk vrij gemiddeld. Want over het algemeen wordt ongeveer 12% van de kuikens groot in die afgelopen 5 jaar. En dat is dus best wel laag. Ook in Zeeland is er gekeken naar die kuikenoverleving door Delta Milieuprojecten. Er waren 133 nesten ingevoerd en gevolgd. Daarvan is maar liefst 55% mislukt al in de eifase. Dus dat is best een hoop. Toch zijn er gelukkig nog 34 nesten succesvol geworden, waar dus in ieder geval 1 jongen is groot geworden. En als je dat dan omrekent, dan kom je op 0,22 jongen per paar die groot zijn geworden, waar je eigenlijk 0,35 nodig hebt. Dus dat was een ondermaats jaar eigenlijk daar. Nou, dit is wel de gegevens van 1 jaar, dus uiteindelijk wil je inzetten op een meerjarige monitoring en ook de aandacht voor vervolgwaarnemingen, zodat die nestkaarten bruikbaar zijn. Tot slot, de broedplatforms kunnen die dienen als een veilige nestlocatie. Nou, er is goed gehoor gegeven aan de oproep om broedplatforms te maken en te plaatsen. Op het kaartje rechts in beeld ziet u een verspreiding van die platforms over Nederland. In totaal zijn er 470 stonden er dit jaar. 381 zijn nieuw neergezet, dus dat is een enorm aantal. Van 370 hebben we ook daadwerkelijk gegevens ontvangen. En van die 370 waren er 49 bezet. En hier links ook een mooi plaatje. Als je goed kijkt, dan ziet u ook de jongen op het platform liggen. Maar dan wil je weten, hoe gaat het dan met die bezette platforms? Nou, van die 49 waren er 42 kwamen succesvol die eifase door. Dat is een percentage van 86%. Denk dan even terug aan het verlies van 55% aan nesten die niet op broedplatforms hebben gebroed in Zeeland. Nou, dan mag je stellen dat dit best wel een mooi resultaat is. Tegelijkertijd weten we van in ieder geval minimaal 22 jongen dat ze vliegvlug zijn geworden. Nou ja, dat is ten opzichte van die 49 platforms is dat een succes van ongeveer 0,44 jongen die per paar groot zijn geworden. En dat ligt dus boven die 0,35. Dus ook dat klinkt best wel positief. Nou, dit hebben we vervolgens niet statistisch getest, maar we kunnen alvast even kijken naar de voorkeuren. Van wanneer lijkt een schoolexter te gaan zitten op een broedplatform. Nou, op het moment dat zo'n broedplatform in een sloot of slootkant wordt geplaatst, lijkt er een hoge bezettingsgraad te zijn. Op het moment dat je grind gebruikt als substraat waar die in kan broeden, en het liefst ook een wat dikkere laag. En wat opvalt is dat ook het plaatsingsjaar wel invloed lijkt te hebben. Dat kunt u rechts zien op het plaatje. Ongeveer 40% van de bezette broedplatforms dit jaar is al een eerder jaar geplaatst. Terwijl dat maar 16% was van het totale aantal broedplatforms. Dus ja, er lijkt wel een stukje gewenning in te zitten. En daarom zeggen we ook van blijf vooral die broedplatforms ook in de komende jaren volgen. En invoeren via Avinest, dat kan hele waardevolle data opleveren. Nou, dat was een beetje de resultaten in een notendop van het jaar van de Scholekster. Er komt dus nog een rapportage waar de resultaten veel uitgebreider worden toegelicht. Wilt u nu al meer weten? Bij de stand van Vogelbescherming liggen hele mooie factsheets voor u klaar over de Scholekster, 3 verschillende. Dus loop daar zeker even langs als u al wat meer informatie wil over die Scholekster. En nou, dan heb ik het volgens mij hopelijk binnen die 10 minuten een beetje gehouden. Blijf dus ook vooral die Scholeksters volgen in 2024. En dan ja, een plezierige dag en dank voor uw aandacht.
Thijs, dankjewel. Goedemorgen, dames en heren. Het is een zaal die al redelijk lekker is volgelopen. Dat was heel fijn. Mijn naam is Theo Verstrael. Ik ga u proberen door het ochtendgedeelte heen te geleiden. En ik mag dat meteen doen door onze speciale gast aan te kondigen. En omdat de speciale gast uit Ierland afkomstig is, ga ik dat in het Engels doen. Want anders is het niet zo heel erg beleefd. En dat is niet zo heel erg fijn natuurlijk. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor to introduce to you our honorary guest for today, Mr. Killian Mullarney from Ireland. And for many of you, he will be very well known because of his involvement in the Collins Bird Guide, better known as the ANWB Vogelgids. There is a new edition available today, and Killian will sign it just after this talk. So if you want to have a new edition, just grab your chance. But before we go to that, he will introduce us to his work in introduce and identification of birds. And it is very special the way that we came into contact with Mr. Mullarney, because our former chairman, Mr. Roelof ten Doesgaten, has a great love to go to Lesbos Island to go bird watching and sunbathing. And he always does that in June. And Mr. Mullarney is a bird tour guide, and he often goes to Lesbos. And if you have ever been to Lesbos, there are numerous hotels all over the place. But it happens to be that both Roelof ten Doesgaten and Killian Mullarney have the same preference for a hotel. And because of that, there has been contact between those two people. And that's why we can welcome Mr. Killian Mullarney today. And I would like to give the floor to him. Mr. Killian Mullarney.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Theo. Yes, and this is the first time I've actually met the former chairman. But my wife and his daughter have become very good friends, so that was the connection. I hope all of you can understand my English. I appreciate that it takes a bit more effort for you. I should explain that ID is short for identification. I spent some time thinking about the title of this talk when I first developed it a few years ago. And the initial working title was A Lifetime of Birding. But the more I thought about that, the more uncomfortable I became with it reminding me of my own mortality. Because in my head, I still imagine I'm probably halfway through, but I know I'm a lot more. But in reality, I have been around for long enough to witness some really huge changes in the way bird watching is practiced, in what we all do. And I hope I haven't been around so long that I've lost touch with things, that I still know what's going on the cutting edge. But over the years, I have to get used to this. Forward. Yeah, I have had the privilege of devoting most of my adult life to working with birds, thinking about birds and specifically about bird identification, which has always been my interest since I was a small child. In this talk, I'm just going to describe my beginnings, my early influences, and I will identify 3, maybe 4 really major changes or influencing factors in the way bird watching has developed over the last 40, 50 years. So this is the book, the third edition of the Bird Guide. I prefer to call it the Bonnier's Bird Guide, but I'll explain why later. So, in the 300 years or so since the great Carl Linnaeus laid down the foundations for what we now regard as modern systematics and so on, things have been changing all the time. But I suspect that the change that has happened in the last 40, 50 years is much greater than any other period. I might be wrong, and I used to think that it'll never be greater in the future, but who knows? No one can tell what happens in the future. And there are some very, very exciting developments even now. But the changes that have happened since I started birdwatching are absolutely huge, and I'm going to go through some of those. These are some of the reference books that I had when I was starting off, all very British orientated, as you can see. So, in typical Irish Catholic tradition, I came from a big family, 5 brothers and 5 sisters. And given that my mother was a trained nurse and my father was an accountant, you'd think they would have been able to limit the number of children. But rather ironically, my mother became a founder member of the Irish family planning movement. And my father was very keen on books, especially old second-hand books. In fact, he worked as an accountant, but he used to supplement his income by trawling the Dublin second-hand bookshops for old books and especially valuable books. And he was clever enough to know that a lot of the books that he could buy in Ireland very cheaply had quite a high value in Britain. So he would get all of the dealers' catalogues, and he had a very good memory. I remember seeing that book for a shilling somewhere, and he would pick up these books and box them up and sell them, and presumably that put more food on the table for all these children. But one of the books that he discovered was a book by Maria Montessori. And at that stage, my eldest brother and sister had been born, and my parents lived in a pretty remote area, a long way from any school, a long way from any bus, and they didn't have a car. So this book by Maria Montessori inspired them to try homeschooling, which was a very, very new thing in Ireland. This would have been the late 40s, early 50s. In fact, my mother was so keen on homeschooling, she wrote a book about it in the end, called Anything School Can Do, You Can Do Better. She didn't convince everyone, but a lot of people followed her example. Anyway, homeschooling meant that we had 2 or 3 hours every morning of lessons. But I apparently had no interest in lessons. I just wanted to be out in the garden looking for birds. My interest in birds developed as early as anyone can remember, from the age of 4 or 5. But consequently, all my brothers and sisters were reading at the age of 3 or 4, whereas I was just out climbing trees and looking for birds. But my mother had the bright idea that if she bought me a bird book, that might give me more interest in reading, and it certainly did. And she happened to buy a book illustrated by a Dutch artist, Rein Stuurman. I didn't really appreciate who he was at the time. I probably didn't even know, but I'm sure some of you probably know more about Rein Stuurman than I do. But I particularly appreciate that I was given a book with really beautiful illustrations. I think even now, these stand out as being exceptionally accurate, but evocative, lovely suggestions of habitat. And I spent hours and hours copying these drawings and paintings as a child. The other thing that we had at home, my mother had learned that in China, young children given a paintbrush at the age of 2 or 3 produced interesting results. And we had a very large white tiled wall in our kitchen. And all of us would spend lots of time just messing about with painting on the wall. Anything that was any good was left up for a couple of days, but it was all washed off eventually. But it was a very good way of keeping us interested, and in days when there was no television, that probably made raising a family a little bit easier. But I'm just showing you a few samples of these beautiful Ryan Sturman paintings. And then when I grew out of that book, she got me another book with a very strange title, Birds One Should Know, Beneficial and Mischievous, by Reverend Canon Theodore Wood, another very British book, but again, beautifully illustrated by an artist called Roland Green, who didn't attract very much notice, but his work is outstanding. And anyone who has ever drawn in pen and ink will realize that how skillful these are. I mean, with black ink on white paper, which was really the only method that could be reproduced easily back at this time, you have to try and achieve all of the subtlety and so on without any color. But I think Roland Green was way ahead of his time. I love these illustrations. This was always one of my favorites, a lineup of swallows, young swallows. And look at the drama and speed in this lovely sketch. There's a lovely simplicity about these, as there was with Ryan Sturman's work. And these were hugely inspiring to a small child interested in birds. But it was quite some time before I started drawing birds from life. First of all, another big event in our household, because we all painted, was this art competition that happened every year. This was a chance for us to win prizes like bicycles or transistor radios, things that we simply wouldn't have had otherwise. So for a month or two, we all were busy producing paintings, and I won several times, but one year I actually won first prize in my category. I guess it was 7 or 8. I was age 7 or 8, with a painting of a thrush, just a big outline with spots. I did this a few years ago. This wasn't the actual painting. I don't have that any longer. But I remember it being something very simple like this. But as I say, it was some years after this, maybe when I was 14 or 15, before I started to draw birds from my own observations. And that was a revelation, because while the drawings weren't necessarily very good, I realized how much you learn when you're drawing from life, because it trains you to look. And actually, I think the looking is much more important than the drawing. The drawing doesn't really matter if it turns out or not, but if you go through the process of looking and thinking about what you're seeing, it really helps you understand it at a different level. So this was my first osprey. Every time I see an osprey shaking itself after coming out of the water now, shaking like a dog, I remember the first time I observed this. And that was a very exciting bird, a very rare bird in Ireland, still quite rare. They've just started to reintroduce them now. My first little gull, as you can see at the time, I was struggling a little bit with getting to know my way around a bird, the feather groups, and I was probably still influenced by the illustrations that I had been copying, many of which would have been drawn from dead birds, from skins. So often the topography didn't quite relate to what you see in life. But again, I was always very keen on the trickier aspects of identification. In fact, that interested me more than painting, per se. My first grey phalarope. So these were my early notebooks. I think something must have happened with that left-hand one. I must have made a mess of it and tried to do a better one and stuck it over. So some of the older members of the audience will perhaps remember the telescopes that we had from the late 60s, 70s. This is one, the Hertland Royce, and the other, a very similar nickel Supra. And these were draw tube telescopes No one ever used a tripod. You just lean it on a wall or on someone's shoulder or even on your knee if you were flexible enough. But the reality is the image was really terrible. It was, I mean, it really didn't improve things much. It just made it a bit bigger, a bit darker. So not many people use telescopes. And when you went up to zoom, it just got bigger and darker. But that all changed in the mid-70s with the arrival of the Kowa telescope. This was an absolute revelation, and I think this was the first major change for birdwatchers of my generation, to have a telescope that you could actually look through and see the bird clearly. This Kowa, which was very popular in Ireland from the mid-70s, I learned only recently that it had actually been developed for the Tokyo Olympics in 1964 for target spotting. And that's why they had this angled eyepiece, so you could presumably look through the scope and look through your sights at the same time. And for a long time, it was considered, people said it must be unsuitable for bird watching. Well, it certainly proved not to be. In fact, I would say it was better than a straight-through telescope when it comes to sketching. But this is an example of what you could see through the telescope. And apart from having the ability to see the bird clearly, you could see it when you were sufficiently far away not to disturb the bird in any way. So there was no pressure, and this led to really a kind of renaissance in field identification. Before that, a lot of field identification was based on examination of birds in the hand, but now you could really see what these things look like in life. And as you can see, when looking through the telescope, the angled scope, I could see my notebook at the same time without having to move my head. So the angled eyepiece actually helped. Initially, I spent a lot of time sketching gulls. The main reason being that gulls are very cooperative. They tend to stand around a lot. You tend to get big flocks where they all are more or less the same. So if the bird you're looking at flies off, you can just go to the next one and hope it's in a similar position. So you have a better chance of completing an illustration. And I can remember the excitement sometimes. For example, on this particular day, I discovered I could never understand why the secondaries, which are very visible on passerines, the secondary feathers, secondaries on a young gull have a dark band, but why can't you see them when the bird is at rest? And these were the kind of questions I wrestled with. And this bird, I remember watching it flying in and folding its wing and seeing how neatly this secondary tract are covered by the greater coverts, which is very different from a passerine. And suddenly that made sense. And it was as exciting for me as finding a major rarity, just to understand that point. And there were lots and lots of examples of that, thanks to the telescope. So it wasn't all gulls, but gulls did feature a lot. And these are some early sketches of scoters. I remember noticing how common scoters, when they flap their wings, they always simultaneously throw their head down, and that was something that had never been described. And it's not earth-shatteringly new, but it's quite useful if you think you have a surf scoter at very long range, and if it sits up and does this, you know it's just a common scoter. I used to be asked a lot about sketching. What are the main any tips I could give? And if any of you have ever tried sketching birds, you'll know that it can be very frustrating, because the subject, more often than not, walks away or flies away or doesn't stay standing still long enough. And I've often encouraged people to just look at the bird, just make a note of whatever feature you see, be it the length of a leg or the shape of a beak or the shape of an eye, or whatever. It doesn't have to be all together. I would often spend several pages just doing bits and pieces, and eventually, maybe after half an hour or an hour, you begin to learn about the bird. You understand how it fits together, and then you might complete something a little bit more, well, complete. But it doesn't matter, even if you don't complete it. It's the looking. That really is where you're getting the benefit. Occasionally with a sketch, I would add paint at home. I know I should paint in the field, and there are probably people here who do paint in the field, and I have tried it at times, but it really requires a bit more discipline than I have. I constantly want to be looking for more birds or rare birds or whatever. But if I paint quickly after I get home, I can still remember the colors. So I filled many, many sketchbooks over the years. Now I think I'm going to come to the next major change that really benefited my generation, and that was the ease of travel. From the late 70s on, it was very easy to go to Israel or Spain or wherever and get familiar with a whole host of new birds that up to then I had just seen in books. Israel was a destination I used to go to a lot. I don't go there anymore. Cinereus bunting, little crake. It was amazing to see little crakes, a bird that I'd only dreamt of, and to see them so clearly. They're quite common on migration and right out in the open. And I can remember when I saw this bird, a scrub warbler, I had no idea what it was because the only book that showed it showed a different subspecies, and it looked nothing like this. So over the years, I've built up many, many sketchbooks. And I just want to briefly describe the main field guides at that time. This was through the 70s and 80s. Many of you will know the Peterson Guide, which first came out in 1954, I think. And Peterson, an American artist, he did a fantastic job illustrating a European field guide. Then there was the Hamlin Guide that came out in 1970, also illustrated by an American artist. And this was the first guide that had the text opposite plates. Then there was the Heinzel Guide that came out just a couple of years later. This was clearly an attempt by Collins publishers to get some of the sales that this book, because this book is really a copy of this in a way. And then much later on, 83, the Shell Guide, which had very good text, not so good illustrations. But I'll just go through these. It's amazing to think that Peterson covered the 16 species of gull that we had in Europe at the time. We've got a few more since because of splitting and range change. But he covered 16 species of gull in 2 plates. This and this, these 2 plates. So there were no standing birds, there was no color, and there were very little attention paid to immature plumages, just juveniles and adults in flight. But he still did an amazing job in such limited space to give such a reasonably good overall account of gulls. But it's no wonder it took another 20, 30 years for us to get to grips with the more difficult gulls. Arthur Singer in the Hamlin Guide was much more ambitious with gulls. For the first time we had color, we had immature plumages, and text opposite plates, which really, really helped. So he attempted the really difficult plumages. It's interesting to see that Arthur Singer painted his herring gull is actually an American herring gull. I don't think anyone noticed at the time, but this all dark tail is a feature of American herring gull, but not of European. But of course, what would you expect? He was an American artist. He probably didn't appreciate that they were different. And then there was a Heinzel Guide. Heinzel did an amazing job. He painted these plates so quickly. I think it was within 3 or 4 years. because he had to catch up on the very popular Hamlin Guide. But to be honest, they really weren't that good. And when you look at the waders, it's, well, not surprising that people would struggle with things like stints. At that time, there was virtually no books showed juvenile plumages. They sometimes illustrated juveniles, but there was no recognition of juvenile plumage as opposed to, there was just summer and winter. So these things were, well, they were just something in between summer and winter. Anyway, clearly not adequate for identification of the difficult birds. Peterson was, even though he painted 20 years earlier, he was still a little bit better. His autumn little stint looks kind of like a juvenile. And this was the Shell Guide, which was, as I said earlier, had a very good text by James Ferguson Lees. Illustrations were variable, sometimes very good, but when it comes to tricky tree pipit and meadow pipit, the main difference I could see here was that the tree pipits are facing left and the meadow pipits are facing right. And I know someday someone's going to be looking at my illustrations and having a laugh at my expense, but I mean, the reality is that it was Ian Willis painted this, and he was a very, very talented artist, but he was slightly ahead of me. He didn't have the advantage of the optical equipment, the cameras, the travel, and so on. So it wasn't really an even playing pitch. And this, I really feel sorry for Ian Willis having been asked by his author, I guess, to illustrate Gargany in female, eclipse male, and juvenile. And he's more or less painted them all the same. None of them is correct. So. And just before leaving Peterson, I think Peterson's painting was really remarkable. When you think that he did this in the 50s, and they still stand up now. They're beautiful, and there was a beauty to his paintings. He really invested the birds with a character and personality, which I'm sure was hugely influential in popularizing bird watching. Who wouldn't want to see these birds? And I come back to Roland Green. In that second book that my mother got, years later I discovered that he had painted some of the plates in the Handbook of British Birds, and they were really good. He did know the difference between juvenile and adult winter and so on, much more so than was shown in some of the field guides that came even later. But then the next big revelation, at least for me, was the art of Swedish artist Lars Jonsson. When I first came across these books in Dublin's biggest bookshop, I saw the covers and thought they look interesting. And when I opened them and saw these absolutely amazing illustrations, I can remember I just went into a cold sweat. There were only 2 books available at the time. I quickly took the books off the shelf. In my haste to get to the cash register, I bumped into a whole display of books that just went all over the floor. I didn't care. I just went to the cash register, bought the books, and I think for the next month I had my head in these books, because I had often said to my friends that it should be possible for birds to be depicted in a way where they're accurate but also lifelike, because it had never been done before. But Lars did it and still does it. Lars is still probably the artist that every bird artist looks up to, because he really broke the mold. And his paintings are just outstanding. A huge inspiration to me and to everyone else. Another big influence at that time was the journal British Birds, which I think has been going since 1908. This was where any of the up-to-date discoveries were published. For an English audience anyway. Dutch Birding came a few years later, 1978, and is now, I think, the leading journal. So this was the paper that told me I had to get British Birds, a paper on the identification of stints by Ian Wallace. Really exciting, lots of new information, At the time, I think British birds cost £6 a year, and I've had it ever since 1974. It was a Christmas present from my parents, actually. It took me a few years to find my first semi-palmated sandpiper locally, and I'm sure that the paper that I'd read by Ian Wallace was really important in alerting me to what I should look for. Another very important paper was Peter Grant's paper on ringbill gull, which I'd read many, many times. And in 1979, I discovered the first ringbill gull in Ireland. And I can remember I was with a bunch of friends. We stopped. I always wanted to stop and look at gulls, and they were fed up of me looking at gulls. But I saw this gull flock, and they said, "Stop, stop, stop, stop!" And there in the middle was a ringbill gull. But they were totally unimpressed because it just looked like a gull to them. So they left me there. They kicked me out of the car, left me for 4 hours, and they went off to look for corn buntings, which was the bird that they were trying to see. It wasn't until we got home and I showed them the paper by Peter Grant that they really believed that it was something different. And actually, there were many, many more after this. Around this time, I noticed in a copy of British Birds that there was this photograph captioned Great Northern Diver. And to my eyes, it was clearly a black-throated diver. But I think it was the shape of the head that may have prompted the identification, because black-throated diver was never shown with a peaked head. But I had seen them recently, and I knew that they had. So I wrote to British Birds, and my letter was published with some field sketches. And that very fortuitously led to, I was asked then to write and illustrate a paper on diver identification in British Birds, which is probably my first major contribution to ornithology, I suppose. I still have a very soft spot for the divers. I think they're, well, loons, I'm not sure what you call them in, it is diver in Dutch, I think, yeah. And it was through this connection with British Birds that I was put in contact with Peter Grant. Peter Grant was probably the leading contributor to British Birds magazine at the time. A very, very clever man, very good at explaining complex identification issues. And we corresponded on some subjects, and he invited me to attend the first international identification meeting, which I think was the idea of Gerald O'Reilly. Gerald and Peter organized this, and a bunch of people with the same interest in identification met in Alat. You may recognize Gerald there, a very young Gerald before he got white hair. And there's myself, John Dunn, Bill Oddie, Tim Sharrock, Peter Grant, David Fisher, Richard Porter, a very young Hadaram Shuihai, and Paul Herolin from Belgium. And we had a really, really interesting meeting discussing all kinds of things. And the following year, there was another meeting that Peter and I attended at Falsterbo in Sweden, where I met, let me see, Sten Christensen, Per Ahlström, Jan Olsen, Lars Jonsson. The first time I met Lars Jonsson, which was, as you can imagine, was hugely influential. Lars Svensson, Stellan Hedgren, Joran Valinder, Peter Grant, Lassie Leine, and myself. And these were really fantastically productive meetings. The next one was in California with John Dunn and Will Russell. You'll recognize, whoops, sorry. Back, no. I recognize Arnaud van den Berg and Gerald O'Reilly there. But it seems really bizarre to travel halfway across the world to sit in a dark room looking at slides. But that's what we did for a week. We did some bird watching as well in the afternoons. But this is what we had to do before the internet to share ideas. But they were hugely beneficial to all of us. We all came back with lots of new information. And there was a real feeling, well, we have to do something with this information. So it was around the early 80s that I was invited by Crispin Fisher, who was natural history editor at Collins, to join Lars Svensson and Peter Grant in a new project. This was 6 years before the wonderful Macmillan Guide. It was a little bit longer, 9 years before Lars Jonsson's combined guide. So it was a long time ago. And the idea for the new bird guide would that we would cover Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, not the Cape Verdes. 750 species, 400 pages, 180 plates. So it meant 3 or 4 species per plate. And most importantly, it was anticipated that it would be a 4 to 5 year project. I wonder who worked that out. Anyway, I was the sole illustrator at the time, and my first ideas were based really on the work that I'd seen already. And this was a plate from the Shorebirds Guide, Peter Heyman's beautiful illustrations of the 3 golden plovers, European, American, and Pacific. And much as I admire these illustrations, I do not admire the layout. It is so confusing. It would take you so long to find the right figure and work out what it is, what age, and they weren't necessarily, the key on the left-hand page didn't necessarily correspond to the illustrations. So this was an example of what I did not want in terms of design. And clearly, if you have 3 or 4 species per plate, you really have to put a lot of time into the design. So with these 3 species, this was eventually what I worked out. And the idea was to have the juveniles on the left, winter next, and then breeding adult. Throughout the book, for every species, to have a consistency and to have the juveniles of all 3 will be in a similar position. Everything I felt needed to be, you needed to facilitate comparisons, to allow the reader make direct comparisons. And if one bird was doing something and the other bird was doing something else, that makes it a bit more difficult. So consistency and, consistency was really but also to have introduced some variety in the postures and so on. And also to put captions for the captions showing the key points, not every point, but the key points. Because I think the more you have around the illustration, the more information, the easier it is to absorb and access. I'll just show you what was involved then. When I eventually was satisfied with the design, I would put my template on a light box, put a thin watercolor paper over it. The watercolor paper had to be thin in order to be able to see the image through. And then start the drawing and eventually the painting. But it was eventually. It took a very long time. All of these plates were taking so much longer than, well, I hadn't really projected at the beginning how long it would take, but they took a very long time. And some plates were much more complicated, to try and get consistency on this plate with all of the different plumages. I think I did about 28 different drafts before I finally worked out what I thought was best. Of course, the disadvantage is the figures are quite small. It used to bother me, but now that I have to use these things, it does bother me. But I felt that it was really important that you not leave out plumages, that you try and be comprehensive. And the publishers actually then produced a large format book, which is a really beautiful book to look through. Sometimes the plates were very easy. I could just paint something directly from a field sketch I had done. So it wasn't all difficult, but some of them were difficult. So after 4 or 5 years, only 80 plates had been designed, 30 had been painted, half of those I wanted to repaint, and less than 50% of the text had been written, so we were in trouble. Around this time, the commissioning editor, Crispin Fisher, sadly died, a very young man in his mid-40s. Collins Publishers was taken over by Rupert Murdoch, who I guess has a reputation here as well as in the UK. Not a very nice man, not very interested in standards. Consequently, all of the good people left the natural history department in Collins, and the person who took over, well, he phoned me. Sorry, the other thing that happened was, sadly, Peter Grant died again very quickly of pancreatic cancer. So we were really in trouble. It looked as if we may not. Sorry, I'll just go back. Yeah, it looked as if we might not get to finish this book. And in fact, I had a phone call from the person in HarperCollins. He said, "Will you be able to finish the book in 18 months?" At the time, I wasn't sure I'd be able to finish in 18 years, but I didn't tell him that. I told him that it would take at least 3 or 4 years, and even then I was lying. And 2 weeks later, I was told that HarperCollins had pretty much pulled out of the project. They weren't going to continue with it. But fortunately, Bonniers, biggest publisher in Sweden, they were prepared to listen to us. Myself and Lars went to meet them and try and explain that what we're planning to do is a much bigger project than we envisaged, and that it would take another 6, 7 years at least, and it would need another artist. And I knew exactly who the artist should be. I had met Dan Zetterstrom in Israel a few times and in China, and I knew that he and I had a very, very similar approach to painting birds. We were both bird watchers, primarily bird watchers who painted. We weren't artists who had chosen birds. It's a slight difference. That we were both very keen on identification. We're both very keen on looking at live birds, seeing how they look in reality, not so much skins and so on. So Dan was persuaded to give up his job in a power station and join the team. And that was a real shot in the arm, because Dan, not only is he one of the best painters on birds of prey, which was not something I was particularly looking forward to, but he's also very fast. He's a very, very efficient artist, much more so than I am. And it was a huge relief to have Dan's expertise with the birds of prey that are such an important part of any identification book. His expertise and the beauty of his plates. And the owls. So despite all of the obstacles, in 1999, our book was published, and it has done very well since. And I'm hugely appreciative that the publishers, Bonniers, stuck with it and have been very supportive all along. But I'm not quite finished yet. It was also published in many different languages. I think there's a Dutch one there on the bottom left. I think it's in 25 languages now, some very small editions. So I want to talk about the difference in sourcing reference material, because in the old days, when there were just a few magazines and no internet, it was very hard to find reference material if it wasn't your own photos. And there were many species where we were short of reference material. One of the birds, CC partridge, which has a very limited distribution in eastern Turkey. I remember Dan was painting them, and he asked me, did I have any photos? No, I had no photos. I had just this one field sketch, which really isn't enough to base a painting on. But I spent a morning going through all my books, and I found one photograph in a book, Birds of Russia. One photograph of a CC partridge, which was like gold dust to Dan. The difference that made to have a photograph of a live bird, not to have to rely on some dusty, smelly old skin to try and imagine what the thing looked like. And that's how difficult it was. There are still some birds, and I'm not going to tell you, some birds have been painted without any reference material, and I'm very anxious to get back to them. But just out of interest, a few years ago, I put CC partridge into Google Images, and it told me that there were 4,560,000 photographs. That can't be true. But sure enough, I started scrolling through. The first page, there were CC partridges. The next page, more CC partridges, more than I'd ever seen. Then the further in you go, I mean, it's still a long way short of 4 million, I start to see other things like guns and then it suddenly became very obscure. I'd only got into about 40 or 50 photographs. I thought, sorry. I thought, where's the CC partridge in this? When I clicked on it, I could see, sure enough. Of course, the danger is you get distracted. Audrina partridge, who would have known? But now, I mean, thanks to eBird, which is such an amazing resource, I checked yesterday. Well, when I did the slide, there was 123 photographs of CC partridge. Yesterday, there were 210. So it really has changed everything, this proliferation of photographs. For a species like American golden plover, which is one of these species that really requires a lot of research to identify American from Pacific, from European. When I did this slide, there were nearly 15,000 photographs of American golden plover. Even I couldn't go through all those. But it is a hugely valuable resource. And I'm not the only person who's noticed this. So I want to talk a little bit about the difference between illustrated books and photographic guides. They're all illustrations, but you appreciate the difference. When I say illustrations, I mean paintings and the challenges that they both present. These are just a few of my own photographs of meadow pipit. And the idea of I can't show 10, 15 different birds. That would be more confusing than helpful. So as an illustrator, I have to try and distill, try and get the most important features or the average look, whatever. And when you try and do this with photographs, I think it's much more difficult because the lighting here, I mean, they're a similar position, but this one is in sunlight, this one is backlit, colors change. It's very, very difficult with photographs to really produce images that are good comparisons. It can be done, but it's difficult. Whereas with illustrations, the artist has more control. You can show birds in precisely the same position. You can paint them with the same color palette, so it's possible to change colors. So I still think that there is an advantage in illustrations. There are advantages in photographs too, but I think illustrations for communicating quite complex information in a simplified way. Okay, so these are some of the photographic guides that are available now. And it's easy to think, well, what could be wrong? I mean, they're all correctly identified. And what could be better than photographic guides? And it may be that there isn't. I think it may take some time. I love photographic guides. I learn a lot from them. But I've noticed that especially people who are new to bird watching don't get on so well because it's like there's information overload. I mean, these are beautiful. Actually, I think a lot of these plates have been based a little bit on the Collins Guide, the arrangement and so on. And with the next edition of the Collins Guide, I think I will derive something from this and try and like stepping stones, try and learn something from these plates. I think these are really fantastic for people who know their birds, but maybe a little bit more difficult for people who don't. This is another photographic guide, the Crossley Guide, which shows the birds in habitat. And wonderful as they are, I find it quite confusing. Whereas these plates by Hans Larsson in the Seabirds book, I love the way that they've been arranged. I think it's much easier to make comparisons, bill color, upper parts color. It's a very good use of space. Another Hans Larsson plate. And here, Sibley, he really does simplify everything. And I think that's why the books work so well. They don't always give you the satisfaction of showing the full beauty of the bird, but when it comes to identification, That's often not necessary. And I have to show you some of my favorite illustrations from a Japanese duck guide. Really, really beautiful. I think these have all of the advantages of a photograph in terms of accuracy, but the beauty of illustration. And finally, I was very privileged to I called on my friend Ian Lewington, who's working on an American guide. He's nearly finished. And I think that Ian's work represents probably the pinnacle of field guide illustration. I think it'll be a long time before photographs can compete with this, just for sheer beauty, clarity, and conveying all the information that's needed. I said to Ian, I think that this work is probably the most important bird illustration since Audubon. They're just whoops. Outstanding. I very appreciate Ian having allowed me show you these. Make sure you get him here someday. So I hope, I'm just going to very quickly, this is another Ian's, quickly finish up with the new guide and show you very briefly some of the newer plates. We've added Pacific Loon, which will assure to appear in Holland any day now. I think they've had several in Sweden now. In Ireland, we've had quite a few. Britain, they're turning up everywhere. And Saunders tern, a bird that was a big mystery for the last 40 or 50 years, but it's suddenly become clear how to identify them. You'll recognize some of the plates are a mixture of old and new. And Dan has repainted many of the plates. They're the same plates, but he's given a new impression of these wonderful birds. So I'm hoping that you'll all continue to buy illustrated guides for another few years and keep myself and other people in a living. So I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Killian, thank you very much for a very interesting and inspiring talk. You have to go to sign the new edition of the guidebook, so there are no questions available and possible. Thank you very much. You will be around the whole day.
Yeah.
So if you have any questions for
Killian,
Killian,
you can approach me by all means.
he will be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Great. Let's go. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
See you later.
Dames en heren, over een paar minuten beginnen we met de volgende lezing. We zijn iets uitgelopen. We gaan proberen om de volgende lezing